At the entrance to Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego stands a monument to a Navy carrier that many may not have heard of. It is the USS Omni Bay, and it was attacked and sunk in the Sulu Sea in January of 1945. While many were lost, many did survive. One of those survivors is Joseph Robertson, and his story is not only one of survival, but how he found his faith adrift.
My friend Sidney and I had decided that we wanted to be sailors in the Navy because his older brother was a Marine stationed at Panama, and on his return to the States, we visited with him, and he told us how he had joined the Marines at age 17 with his parents' consent, and we could do the same if we wanted to when we got to be 17. Well, Sidney and I had been so impressed by his brother that we decided that we would do likewise, so we talked to our parents and they said yes. When we were 17, they would give their consent, but when I was 12 and got their consent, the war had not started. Hitler was still building his power, and so by the time I turned 17 in June 1943, I went to my father on my birthday and I said, okay, Dad, I'm ready to join the Navy now, and you said you would go with me and sign your permission for me to go in. And he said, Joseph, I know I told you that, but the war wasn't going then, and if something happened to you, I could never forgive myself, so you're going to have to wait until you're 18 and do it on your own. Well, I was devastated because I was looking forward to that. I wanted to get in and then fight Hitler and the Japanese who had bombed Pearl Harbor by that time. But my dad was steadfast. So I went down to a local pool hall and I found a guy there, and I told him my sad story about how my father had lied to me. And he felt sorry for me, so he said he'd go to the recruiting office with me, which was in the post office, and he would sign my dad's permission. So he went with me, we went down there, and I signed up for the Navy, and this guy signed his name as my dad. I had given him the information he needed for that. So the Navy accepted me, and they put me on a bus which was waiting outside and took me down to Pensacola, Florida, which was a Navy base, and they had a boot camp down there. So I went to the boot camp. It was only 3 weeks long, and I finished that in 3 weeks and was assigned to go to a Navy training school. It started in Pensacola to be an aviation ordnanceman, and I enjoyed that a lot. We were assigned to the USS Omni Bay, CVE 79, and we boarded the Omni Bay right there in San Diego, and we sailed out, and our planes landed after we sailed out. They landed on the flight deck, and we started moving toward Pearl Harbor. And we got to Pearl Harbor, and we worked providing landing experiences for other airplanes. All kinds of airplanes were landing while our planes were stationed at Pearl Harbor. And finally, our captain told us that we were heading out to the South Pacific and we were going to be in very dangerous waters. And if we had anything valuable, we should send it home. And the only thing I had was this Bible that Miss Margie Holland had given me, and I sent that home. And as you'll recall, the post office let us mail things for nothing. We all just had to give our name and address on the envelope, and we were free. And so I mailed that Bible back to my parents' home because it was, there may have been another few things, but I don't remember what they were, but I remember that. Our first engagement was at Palau. The Marines were going to land there and take the island away from the Japanese. And we provided them the air support. And that worked out very well. We were successful. We bombed Palau. We destroyed the opposition airplanes on the airfield there. And we finished that. We sailed from there to the Philippines to escort MacArthur in his return, which was a historic event. And so I guess before we went there, we did the same thing on Peleliu with the Army. They invaded Peleliu, which was near Palau. And then we left from there for the Philippines. And our first assignment there was at, I forget what the island, but we supported the Army landings, and we had to shoot down the airplanes that came to attack us, and we were successful. And so then we sailed from there to escort MacArthur's major army to Luzon for his invasion, to his big return. And so we went there and got to, I forgot the name of the sea, and we were attacked by a suicide bomber that hit our ship, and it eventually was sunk. It started blowing up the airplanes on the hangar deck, and on the flight deck he crashed into the bridge and then careened down onto the flight deck. And the planes there were all full of gasoline and bombs and rockets, and they were set afire. And it got to be inhospitable, and the captain ordered us to abandon ship. And so I looked over the side into the water, and there were a bunch of guys in the water, so I couldn't jump. I went down a rope from the flight deck to the water, and before I turned loose of the rope, I saw a life raft in the distance, and I just decided I would go to that life raft, and it was empty, nobody was on it. So I headed for that life raft, and I began to worry about my agnosticism, not believing anymore. And so I began to pray as I swam. I said, Lord, if you'll help me get to that life raft, I'll do whatever pleases you from now on. And so I made it successfully to the life raft. And I got there and climbed in and all by myself. And I looked back toward the ship, and it was just blowing up and burning, and it was just terrible. But between the ship and my life raft, I saw a guy struggling in the water. And a voice spoke to me, and which I believed was God at that time. And it said, Joe, if you want to please me, I want you to go and rescue that guy before he drowns. So I made my way to his side, and I came up behind him, and I had a little training in life-saving. So I said, if you'll just be careful, if you'll just relax, I'll take you to that life raft and we'll both make it. So he relaxed, and I put my arm around his neck and I towed him to the life raft. But by the time I got to the life raft, it was full of other sailors, and there's no room for me or this wounded sailor that I had rescued. So I said to the guys that were in the life raft, one of you guys has to get out because this guy is wounded, he's bleeding, he's going to attract sharks. We've got to get him in the life raft. So sure enough, one of the guys jumped out, and the others pulled him into the raft, and the guy that jumped out and I held on to the raft until a whaleboat came and picked us all up, and they took us to the destroyer escort, the USS Patterson, and we climbed aboard, and we relaxed and felt good, and I thanked the Lord that I had made it, and they picked up a total of 125 guys, and that was more than they could care for on that little destroyer escort. So they told us just to sit tight and make ourselves comfortable until dark, and they were going to put us on a bigger ship. And so sure enough, when it got dark, they pulled up behind the battleship New Mexico, and they tied a rope from the bow of the Patterson to the stern of the New Mexico, and they put a plank across to the New Mexico, and all 125 of us walked across that plank to the New Mexico, and I thank the Lord that we made it, including the guy that I rescued and who had been injured, and so the New Mexico gave us our evening meal, and that was the first meal I'd had since breakfast, and I was hungry and we ate, and so we were escorting MacArthur's army to Luzon to make his return, and so we waited until MacArthur came up, and so we started bombarding Luzon, hitting the little caves that were there on the island, making room for MacArthur to make a safe landing. And so I guess we did a pretty good job of bombarding the island, because meantime the other planes were also bombing it, and MacArthur landed, I forget the date, but it was soon after my ship was sunk, January the 4th. Maybe it was the 7th or 8th, I don't remember. But we escorted him for his landing. Well, then after he was safely there on Luzon, the captain of the New Mexico had arranged for a ship to pick us up. So it was a troop ship called the Alco Polaris. It was converted from a cargo ship to a troop ship. And so we waited until dark, and then we got on from the New Mexico, we went to the Alco Polaris, and we headed up to the island that we first took to pick up some more people like ourselves who were sailors. There were Marines, soldiers, all kinds of people. So we picked them up and we headed for the United States, and on the Alco Polaris. And we had a very strict troop commander. The ship was manned by a merchant marine. They had their captain, and then we had our captain, who was a soldier. And turned out that he was a rather cruel person. He gave us all chow cards, and when they punched the chow card when we went through the chow line, we could only go through once, and they gave us very little to eat. So by the time we reached the States, I was down from 180 pounds to 154, and just from eating the food that I got. You could only go through the chow line once. They punched your card so you couldn't go through again, and they gave you very little. So it was a starvation diet. And I got to the States, and I think it was the last of March or the 1st of April, but it was just before President Roosevelt's death. And so there in San Francisco, they reissued me uniforms and clothing, all that I had lost on the ship, which was everything. The only thing that I had saved from the ship was this knife that had been issued to me in boot camp when they gave me my clothes. And then we sank in the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea. we sank a heavy cruiser, and I loaded the torpedo onto the torpedo bomber that sank that heavy cruiser. And this was the trigger that started the engine on the torpedo. And I had a crew of 3 or 4 guys working under me, and we loaded that torpedo on the torpedo bomber, and this was the trigger. And when they dropped the torpedo, this went up and started the motor. By the time I was discharged from the Navy at Pearl Harbor, after 4 years of service in the Navy, I went back to the States. I think I flew, and they paid me for 4 years, 30 days a year for all that vacation time that I had due me, and that gave me quite a bit of money. And in the meantime, I had, while I was at Pearl Harbor, I had started a checking account in the bank, or a savings account, and I saved all the money I could, and it was about $5,000. So when the captain of the squadron I was assigned to at Pearl Harbor dismissed me, he gave me his blessings, which were appreciated, and we got back to the States, and I went home to my parents in San Bernardino, California, to start junior college. And so I finished junior college and went to Berkeley to finish my last 2 years. And I enjoyed that immensely. I majored in journalism. I was going to be a journalist. And so by the time I graduated, the minister of the church, the Presbyterian church in Berkeley, talked me into going to seminary. And he told me my journalism training would come in handy. So I enrolled at San Francisco Theological Seminary. And I went there, and I eventually graduated in I think it was 1954, yeah. And I married my sweetheart that I had been making love to all those years.